One might think that the central question of theology or the philosophy of religion is, does God exist? However, I'm less sure about that myself. For me, the key terms implicated in that question require some reflection and consideration. For example, what do we mean by God? And what do we mean by existence? It is common to uh, witness a kind of discourse between theists on the one hand, those that hold that God does exist, and atheists on the other, who hold that God does not exist. And my sense is that this entire discourse, does God exist, does God not exist, is um, misleading, and it gets off on the wrong foot in a sense. Let me explain what I mean. So, the Christian faith and the Christian mystical tradition in particular is atheistic. Um, Sounds like a contradictory or a paradoxical thing to say. How could Christianity be atheistic? Surely it's a theistic position. Well, um, what I mean by that is that an atheistic position is a position which holds that God does not exist. And the Christian mystical tradition holds just this. And it depends upon how we understand existence. And this brings us into ontology. What does it mean for something to be? And a classical Platonic picture of being is uh, holds to a participation metaphysics, um, in which everything that is and everything that exists by virtue of its share in the ground of being, the source of being, which we can call God. And there is, on this understanding, a hierarchy of participation in being, from simple mineral planes, um, metals in the earth, atoms, cells, um, up to higher orders, to things that grow, to plants, to trees, to vegetation, to animals which can sense and respond to their environment, um, through drives, through instincts, and finally to the human being, who has a vegetative component, has an animal component, and has a rational component, um, a mind nous, which shares in the divine in a way that is more full or complete relative to these lower strata. So this hierarchy of being, this scala naturae, is derived from the philosophy of Aristotle. It's quite a classical sort of picture. And I mention it because it illustrates a vision of the cosmos and all that exists from the lowest to the highest, um, as sharing in some manner, in some way, at some level, in the ground of being. Now, the Orthodox Christian claim is certainly not that God is any of those grades of being. Anything that is and exists, it's not God. Um, because, as I've just said, anything that is existing is doing so by virtue of the plenitude and the fullness and the radiance of God. God is the source, the ground, the fullness of being. And that fullness is transcendent. That means it goes beyond any given instantiation of being, any given portion of being. And yet, each portion of being only is in relation to God, only is by sharing in God, by partaking in God. But what we mean by God here is certainly not something that exists. Um, a tree exists, a cat exists, it actually exists. You can see the cat climbing the tree, and the human beings exist. And this brings us to metaphysically basic things, such as why is there anything rather than nothing, which um, is a fundamental metaphysical question. Um, and so, if we're saying there is something that exists, or I guess if we sort of negate nothing, we're saying that there is not nothing, there's something. Well, like, okay, like, how come? Like, how are we going to explain that? And this is a non-naturalistic question, it's a metaphysical question. This is before we have any atoms, before we have any Big Bang, any singularity, beyond any measurable natural phenomenon. This isn't a scientific question, it's a metaphysical one. Um, why is there not nothing? And so if we say there is something, um, at the same time, that something is kind of clunky language because it's not a thing. It must, it again, probably kind of inadequate, must be a transcendent fullness, a fullness that is infinite. Infinite because not finite, not bounded, not limited. Like all things that exist are limited in that sense. Everything on the scale of being um, is, in some sense, finite and limited, whereas the ground and the source of all being is not. And so, to this claim that Christianity is an atheistic religion, well, yes, it is because it depends how we understand atheism, of course. But I mean, on the surface, what atheism means is the belief in the non-existence of God. And I fully embrace this position. It's completely orthodox to believe that God does not exist. Of course, God does not exist because existence as a category, if we understand it in the correct metaphysical frame, implies a share in being, or the transcendent source of being, the ground of being, to which uh, mystics within the Christian tradition, particularly Dionysius, the Areopagite, or Pseudo Dionysius, as he's now known, inheriting Neoplatonic uh, metaphysical categories, speaks of God in precisely these terms, the transcendent, beyond all name, beyond even being. Uh, and so it's perfectly appropriate to embrace the idea of atheism as compatible with and complementary to Christian orthodoxy, interestingly enough. And I think this is an important thing to say simply because it has been my observation that there are many debates, kind of analytic debates between I believe God exists, I believe God does not exist, and a kind of uh, debate between these positions. And it kind of gets off on entirely the wrong footing because there's sort of an assumption about what is meant by God there, which is at a minimum sort of out of step with what the traditional teaching of the Christian faith actually is, what the mystics actually hold. Uh, Rather, we might ask, what is God? And there, that opens very rich vistas to us, rich vistas of exploration and consideration and contemplation. After all, it's a word, and it's a word so freighted with meaning that everyone sort of knows what they think it means. It's kind of part of it's part of what interests me about theology is precisely that. It's a very difficult question, and much ink has been spilt over the topic of what is God. Many centuries of contemplation, and it continues to exercise our minds to this day. What is God? And if I can communicate something in this video, besides a critique of the framing between theism and atheism, it would be that this term God pertains to a metaphysical and ontological category. We're talking about what being with a capital B is, and what transcends being, what grounds being, what the source of being is, and what the conditions for existence are. That is what I think the idea of God gets at, among other things. Um, but that's the central claim here. And therefore, a simple binary of does God exist? Yeah, it kind of confuses the discourse, I feel. So we might ask, what is God? And we might also ask, what is existence? Which, if we take my previous claim about the ontological, the metaphysical weight of the question, what is God? What is existence? Is a very similar or related question, is it not? What does it mean to exist? What does it mean to exist as a finite being, knowing that we will die, knowing that we are limited, knowing that all of our hopes and dreams have limitations upon them because we are mortal as human beings? What does a mortal existence entail? What does existence entail as such? What are the conditions that make this possible? So I'll aim to wrap up the video there with, on the one hand, a critique of the atheism-theism sort of debate in the philosophy of religion and contemporary discussions about religion. I think it entirely misframes what is most theologically important from the beginning. It gets off on the wrong foot. It assumes a conception of God which is um, inadequate, and it suggests that the most important uh, thing to answer is like whether God exists. Whereas I would encourage us to slow down and to ask reflective and contemplative questions. What is God? And what is existence? And from this place, we can then move into an exploration of the great mystery we find ourselves in, and um, hopefully come to greater insight about the nature of things and the human condition. So, thank you for listening.